Tonight we begin with the life and legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt, a first lady unlike any before her. She wasn't just a prominent figure in American politics. She was a force in the global fight for human rights. From the elegant halls of the White House to the earnest chambers of the United Nations, Eleanor shaped the 20th century with quiet determination and unshakable principles. So before we settle in, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it resonates with you. And if you're up for it, drop a note in the comments about where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are deeply moving. Other times, admittedly, they're a bit more ordinary. But tonight we're diving into something truly special. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's journey together through the remarkable life of Eleanor Roosevelt. On the surface, Eleanor's life began in privilege. She was born on October 11th, 1884, into one of New York's most distinguished families. Yet beneath that gilded exterior lay a deep and enduring sadness. Her childhood wasn't filled with laughter or warmth, but with loss, loneliness, and a yearning for love. Her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt, was a dazzling socialite, graceful, witty, and painfully critical. She often teased young Eleanor for her serious expression and what she considered plain looks, even calling her Granny. To Eleanor, her mother's affection always seemed just out of reach. Her father, Elliott Roosevelt, the brother of future President Theodore Roosevelt, was her one true source of tenderness. But even that fragile comfort was short-lived. Charming yet plagued by alcoholism, Elliott's presence in her life flickered like a candle in a storm. When Eleanor was just 8, her mother died of diphtheria. 2 years later, her beloved father passed away after being confined to an asylum. By the age of 10, Eleanor was orphaned, left to navigate a world of cold formality under the care of her grandmother. Those early years in her grandmother's home were marked by silence, rigid expectations, and the stiff etiquette of upper-class life. Tall, shy, and introspective, Eleanor often felt invisible, even in her own home. But within that quiet, something vital was taking root. Resilience. She turned to books, to reflection, and slowly built an inner world where worth wasn't tied to beauty or approval. At 15, her life shifted dramatically when she was sent to Allenswood Academy, a progressive girls' school near London. There, under the mentorship of headmistress Marie Souvestre, a woman who defied convention and urged her students to confront injustice, Eleanor truly began to bloom. For the first time, her intelligence and empathy weren't just noticed. They were nurtured. She learned to speak her mind, question the world around her, and trust her own voice. Those years in England left an indelible mark. The girl who once spoke in whispers returned to America as a young woman ready to feel deeply, think critically, and act boldly. Back in the United States, Eleanor re-entered a society governed by polished manners and social duty. At 20, she found herself drawn to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a charming, confident fifth cousin from the Hyde Park branch of the Roosevelt family. Their courtship was steady rather than passionate, and in 1905 they married in a modest ceremony attended by none other than President Theodore Roosevelt, who walked Eleanor down the aisle. In the early years of their marriage, Eleanor fulfilled the expected role. She managed the household and gave birth to 6 children, though only 5 survived infancy. Yet life wasn't easy. Her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, held firm control over the home, even dictating how the children were raised, and Eleanor, ever reserved, often deferred. Still, beneath her quiet exterior, something was stirring. She began volunteering with social reform groups, finding unexpected joy in serving those society had overlooked. In the dim tenements and settlement houses of New York's poorest neighborhoods, she saw real suffering, and something awakened in her. Then came the rupture that would reshape her life. In 1918, Eleanor discovered love letters between Franklin and her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. The betrayal cut deep. She offered him a divorce, but under pressure from his political advisors and family, Franklin chose to stay married. The emotional intimacy between them faded, and their partnership evolved into something more strategic than romantic. But from that heartbreak, Eleanor found a kind of unexpected freedom. With her illusions shattered, she began to forge an identity beyond her husband's shadow. No longer content to be just a supportive spouse, she started writing, organizing, and speaking out. Their marriage endured, but on new terms. Franklin pursued his political ambitions, and Eleanor stepped boldly into the public sphere. What had once been a conventional union became a complex alliance between two people bound by duty, shared purpose, and a vision for a better nation. For much of her early adulthood, Eleanor remained in the background, observant, composed, and quietly present. But a sudden crisis would change everything. In 1921, Franklin was struck by a mysterious illness that quickly left him paralyzed from the waist down, polio, as it was later diagnosed. For a man climbing the political ladder, it was a devastating blow. As Franklin withdrew to their home in Hyde Park to recover, Eleanor stepped forward. At first, it was out of necessity. She attended events in his stead, read letters to him, managed his schedule, and handled correspondence. But gradually, something shifted within her. The woman who once tried to disappear into the wallpaper began to find her voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. With Franklin's encouragement, Eleanor threw herself into public work. She joined the League of Women Voters, the Women's Trade Union League, and the Women's Division of the Democratic Party. She gave speeches, campaigned for progressive candidates, and visited factories and impoverished neighborhoods. She was no longer just supporting Franklin. She was becoming a leader in her own right. This period also brought deeply meaningful personal connections. She formed a close bond with journalist Lorena Hickok, whose friendship offered Eleanor rare emotional honesty and affection. Their thousands of exchanged letters reveal a side of Eleanor seldom seen in public, vulnerable, passionate, and longing for closeness. While the exact nature of their relationship remains debated, what's clear is that Hickok gave Eleanor the space to be fully herself, a rare gift in a world that often demanded women stay within narrow bounds. Eleanor also found strength in communities of women activists, educators, and reformers who welcomed her not as a politician's wife, but as a peer. She traveled alone across the country, to coal mines, sweatshops, and immigrant schools, places most women of her class would never dare to go. She didn't just want to understand the issues from afar. She wanted to witness them firsthand, to touch them, to feel them. By the late 1920s, she was no longer defined by her marriage. She was Eleanor Roosevelt, writer, speaker, teacher, and advocate. Her public identity had been forged through experience, heartbreak, and moral clarity, and the world was starting to take notice. In 1933, as the nation staggered under the weight of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as the 32nd president. Millions listened as he promised a New Deal to revive a broken economy. But standing quietly beside him was a woman who would redefine what it meant to be First Lady. Tradition dictated that First Ladies host tea parties, smile politely, and stay out of policy. But Eleanor had no interest in playing by those rules. Within weeks of moving into the White House, she began carving her own path. She traveled extensively, often alone and without fanfare, visiting coal miners in Appalachia, Dust Bowl farmers, and black families in the segregated South. She listened, not as a distant political figure, but as a fellow citizen who genuinely cared. What she saw appalled her: grinding poverty, systemic racism, and quiet desperation. And so she wrote about it every single day. Her syndicated newspaper column, My Day, offered readers honest, unfiltered glimpses into the lives of ordinary Americans. Written in plain, heartfelt language, it spoke directly to the people, and they listened. Eleanor also broke new ground by holding regular press conferences, but with a twist: only women reporters were allowed to attend. At a time when female journalists were routinely sidelined, she created space for them simply by insisting on their presence. Not everyone welcomed her boldness. Critics called her unladylike. Political cartoons mocked her strong features and outspoken views, but Eleanor refused to shrink herself to make others comfortable. She spoke her truth, even when it stirred controversy. She championed causes decades ahead of their time: affordable housing, child welfare, racial justice, and never waited for permission to act. She simply moved forward, guided by conscience and compassion. And while Franklin led the nation through crisis, Eleanor became his most trusted advisor. She would slip him notes after dinner, sharing what people in the forgotten corners of the country were really saying, what they needed, what they feared, and what they still dared to hope for. She wasn't just redefining the role of First Lady. She was quietly transforming the very idea of leadership. To her, leadership wasn't about grand gestures from afar. It was about listening closely, acting with integrity, and giving voice to those who had long been silenced. As Eleanor's public role grew, so did her courage. In an America still deeply fractured by race, class, and gender, she chose to confront injustice directly, often at great personal and political cost. She believed that public service meant far more than hosting dinners or wearing the right gown. It meant using her platform to challenge silence, even when doing so angered powerful figures or disrupted comfortable norms. One of her most defining moments came in 1939. The world-renowned black opera singer Marian Anderson had been invited to perform in Washington, D.C., a moment that should have been a celebration of art and talent. But the Daughters of the American Revolution, who owned Constitution Hall, refused to let her sing there solely because of the color of her skin. Eleanor, herself a member of the organization, faced a choice. She could have stayed quiet, worked behind the scenes, or tried to smooth things over diplomatically. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She resigned from the group in protest, and then helped arrange for Anderson to perform on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. On Easter Sunday that year, with the statue of Abraham Lincoln towering above her, Marian Anderson sang "My Country, 'Tis of Thee" to a crowd of 75,000 people and millions more listening on the radio. It was a quiet act of defiance that spoke volumes, and it was made possible because Eleanor Roosevelt refused to let prejudice stand unchallenged, even within institutions she once belonged to. In that moment, she showed the nation what moral leadership truly looked like, not in speeches from a podium, but in the willingness to stand with those who were denied their rightful place on the stage. Instead, she publicly resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution and published her letter of resignation in newspapers across the country. Her words were spare but powerful. "You had an opportunity to lead in an enlightened way, and you failed." She didn't stop there. With Eleanor's active support and behind-the-scenes coordination with Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, Marian Anderson performed an open-air concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday, 1939. Over 75,000 people stood in respectful silence as Anderson's voice rose into the spring air, echoing against the marble monument to emancipation and freedom. And though Eleanor wasn't on stage, her presence was felt in every note. She was the quiet force who had made it possible. Eleanor's commitment to racial justice was rare in Washington at the time, and she paid a price for it. She regularly invited black leaders to the White House, a bold move in an era of segregation, including educator Mary McLeod Bethune, whom she considered not just a trusted advisor but a dear friend. Through her widely read column, My Day, she spoke out against discrimination in housing, employment, and education. She did so knowing it would cost her political favor, alienate powerful allies, and sometimes even put her safety at risk. During World War II, she stood against one of the most shameful policies in American history, the forced internment of Japanese Americans. While many remained silent, Eleanor visited the camps, spoke with those imprisoned, and later called the policy a tragic mistake, a position far ahead of public opinion at the time. She understood that truth-telling often came with consequences, but she also believed that silence in the face of injustice was far more dangerous. Her moral compass rarely wavered, and it led her into spaces few first ladies had ever entered, not for recognition, but for justice. And that unwavering loyalty to human dignity would soon take her far beyond the walls of the White House. From the outside, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt's marriage appeared to be a picture of unity, a refined, politically savvy partnership. But beneath the surface lay a far more complex emotional reality, shaped by betrayal, quiet forgiveness, distance, and unexpected sources of love and companionship. Their relationship had already transformed after Franklin's affair with Lucy. Mercer was exposed in 1918, though they chose to stay married, largely for political and familial reasons. The intimacy between them never fully recovered. Over time, they lived increasingly separate lives, often occupying different wings of the White House, bound more by shared purpose than by affection. In search of emotional connection, Eleanor cultivated deep and meaningful relationships with others, most notably with Lorena Hickok, Hick, a sharp, empathetic reporter for the Associated Press. Their correspondence, preserved in thousands of letters, reveals a bond rich with tenderness, longing, and vulnerability. Eleanor signed letters "Darling," confessed her loneliness, and poured out her innermost thoughts in ways she rarely did in public. Whether their relationship was romantic or profoundly platonic, it was undoubtedly one of the most emotionally sustaining of her life. She also found intellectual and emotional warmth in friendships with other women, activists, educators, journalists, who offered her the companionship and stimulation she rarely found at home. Meanwhile, Franklin maintained a connection with Lucy Mercer. Though they agreed never to divorce, the emotional thread between them was never fully cut. In fact, Lucy was quietly by Franklin's side in Warm Springs, Georgia, when he died in April 1945, a fact Eleanor only learned afterward. The revelation reopened old wounds, but by then, she had long learned to carry grief without letting it define her. Despite everything, Eleanor and Franklin remained a formidable team. She advised him on legislation, brought him real-time insights from her travels across America, and kept him grounded in the lives of ordinary citizens. In many ways, she was his moral compass, the conscience that reminded him who he was serving. Their relationship defied easy labels. It wasn't a conventional love story, not quite a friendship, and more than just political strategy. Like Eleanor herself, it was complicated, dignified, and deeply human. When Franklin died in 1945, many assumed Eleanor would quietly retire from public life. After all, she had been First Lady for 12 grueling years, the longest tenure in U.S. history. Surely, they thought, she would retreat to Hyde Park, write her memoirs, and enjoy a well-earned rest. But Eleanor had no intention of fading away. In truth, her most consequential work was just beginning. Later that same year, President Harry Truman appointed her as a delegate to the newly formed United Nations. Some were surprised. She wasn't a diplomat by training, nor a lawyer, and at 61 she was a widow stepping onto a global stage dominated by men. But Truman saw what others missed: her unmatched moral authority, her first-hand knowledge of injustice, and her rare ability to speak not as a politician, but as a human being addressing humanity. Eleanor accepted, and soon found herself appointed chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights. The task was monumental. The world was still reeling from the devastation of World War II. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the full horror of the Holocaust had revealed the depths of human cruelty. Now, representatives from dozens of nations, shaped by vastly different cultures, religions, and ideologies, were being asked to agree on a shared vision of human dignity. The meetings were often tense, filled with clashing viewpoints and moments of deadlock. But Eleanor, with her calm persistence, deep listening, and quiet strength, became the steady hand guiding the process. She insisted that the declaration be written in clear, accessible language so that every person, regardless of education or background, could understand their rights. In December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly. It affirmed that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, a radical idea made real through Eleanor's unyielding belief in its truth. She later called it the proudest achievement of her life. She hadn't arrived at the UN as a head of state or a general, but as a witness to suffering and a champion of the voiceless. And in doing so, she became not just America's First Lady, but in a very real sense, the world's. Even after that historic victory, Eleanor didn't slow down. Freed from the ceremonial constraints of the White House, she embraced her independence with renewed energy. Throughout the 1950s, she wrote tirelessly, columns, essays, books, her voice a constant presence in American life. She spoke out on civil rights, women's equality, education reform, and nuclear disarmament. She never sought popularity. She sought truth, and people respected her for it. She continued to push for racial justice long before it was politically safe to do so, meeting with black leaders, visiting segregated schools, and supporting legal challenges to inequality. In many ways, she served as a living bridge between the New Deal era and the rising civil rights movement. In 1960, when John F. Kennedy ran for president, Eleanor was initially skeptical, concerned that his commitment to civil rights wasn't strong enough. But over time, they developed a mutual respect. Kennedy admired her courage and unwavering principles, and Eleanor, in turn, urged him to listen more closely to the marginalized. After his election, he appointed her chair of the President's Commission on the Status of Women, Yet another role in a lifetime of service that refused to end. Yet another avenue for her to champion justice. By now her health was beginning to decline. Decades of relentless travel, sleepless nights, and emotional labor had taken their toll. But even as her body weakened, her mind remained as sharp and engaged as ever. She continued to speak at universities, answer letters from ordinary citizens, sometimes dozens a day, and gently but firmly remind policymakers that behind every law and every budget was a human being with hopes, fears, and dignity. Eleanor once said, "It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness." And even in her final years, she remained a flame, gentle, steady, unwavering. She wasn't just living history. She was still making it. One letter, one speech, one act of courage at a time. Eleanor Roosevelt passed away quietly on November 7, 1962, at the age of 78. The world mourned not only a former First Lady, but a rare symbol of moral courage, deep empathy, and tireless advocacy. Her death marked the end of an era, but not the end of her influence. If anything, her voice grew louder in the years that followed. She had never sought the spotlight for its own sake. She wasn't flashy, never performed for applause, yet she left behind a legacy that echoes still. In classrooms where human rights are taught, in courtrooms where equality is argued, and in the halls of government where conscience occasionally still guides policy. Her life's work, the unwavering fight for human dignity, racial justice, gender equality, and global solidarity, became a blueprint for generations of activists, diplomats, and ordinary citizens who dared to believe change was possible. From the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to her fearless defense of civil liberties during times of fear and conformity, Eleanor's fingerprints are woven into the very fabric of modern democracy, and yet, perhaps her most enduring gift wasn't a treaty or a policy. It was an idea that anyone, no matter how ordinary, how overlooked, or how unassuming, could become a force for good. That leadership isn't about titles or privilege, but about the quiet courage to speak up for others, even when you stand alone, she once wrote. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. It's easy to forget that Eleanor's own dreams began in the shadows, a lonely child in a grand house, unloved by her mother, adrift after losing both parents before the age of 10. But from that grief, she forged something extraordinary, a belief in something larger than herself. And she used every ounce of her influence, not for status, but to lift others out of silence. In the decades since her passing, she has been honored with statues, schools named in her honor, awards, and even her own U.S. postage stamp. But her truest memorial doesn't lie in marble or ink. It lives in movements, in the voices that rise when others are silenced, in the students who write letters to lawmakers, in the neighbors who share what little they have, in the marchers who walk for justice long after the cameras have gone home. Eleanor once said that human rights begin in small places, close to home, so close, in fact, that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. That's where she began, too. A quiet girl in a big house, a reserved woman in a noisy world, a voice for those told they had none. And as you rest now, perhaps you'll carry a little of her strength into tomorrow, the quiet courage, the unwavering dignity, the steadfast belief that doing good is always worth it. Because sometimes the most powerful people in history aren't the ones who shout the loudest. They're the ones who never stop listening. It began quietly. Just a few stocks dipping in price on an October morning in 1929, but within days the floor gave way. The New York Stock Exchange, once the beating heart of American optimism, collapsed under the weight of its own speculation. Prices plummeted, panic erupted, and by the end of what would be known as Black Tuesday, fortunes had vanished, banks teetered on the edge, and the illusion of endless prosperity shattered like glass. The Roaring Twenties had promised so much. Jazz, skyscrapers, fast cars, and faster profits. Many believed the good times would never end. Middle-class families bought stocks on margin, borrowing money to invest, convinced the market could only go up. But behind the glitter was something brittle. Wealth was wildly unequal. Safety nets didn't exist. The foundation was built on sand. When the market crashed in October 1929, it wasn't just Wall Street tycoons who suffered. It was farmers in Kansas, factory workers in Detroit, school teachers in Ohio. The ripples became waves, and the waves became a storm. Banks, unregulated and uninsured, began to fail. When one collapsed, depositors lost everything overnight. People rushed to withdraw their savings, only to find locked doors and empty vaults. Trust evaporated. Factories halted production. Orders dried up. Employers laid off workers by the thousands. Within months, unemployment surged. Men who once wore crisp suits and provided for their families now stood in bread lines. Children went to bed hungry. Families sold wedding rings, furniture, even shoes, anything to survive. The crash didn't cause the Great Depression alone, but it was the spark that ignited dry fields of an already unstable economy. It exposed the fragility of a system built on speculation, overconfidence, and stark inequality. By the end of 1930, what began as a market downturn had spiraled into a national and soon global catastrophe. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a collapse of the American dream itself. While statistics tell part of the story, billions lost, millions unemployed, it was the human stories that truly revealed the depth of the pain, tales of dignity and despair, of survival against impossible odds, of a nation that fell hard but refused to stay down. As the 1930s unfolded, the Depression tightened its grip. By 1933, unemployment in the U.S. neared 25%. Millions found themselves without work, wages, or hope. The exuberance of the 1920s had given way to long, cold nights of uncertainty. Breadlines became symbols of daily survival. Once proud men in worn coats and frayed hats standing patiently for a bowl of soup or a slice of bread, often the only meal of the day. Shantytowns sprouted on the edges of cities, makeshift communities cobbled together from cardboard, scrapwood, and old metal. People called them Hoovervilles, a bitter jab at President Herbert Hoover, whose hands-off response left many feeling abandoned. These weren't just homeless encampments. They were testaments to human resilience. Families slept in cars, burned newspaper for warmth, and patched clothes until there was nothing left to mend. Inside homes that still had roofs, life was marked by silent sacrifice. Mothers skipped meals so their children could eat. Shoes were stuffed with newspaper to stretch their use. Bartering returned, bread for milk, labor for coal. The economy regressed to its most basic form. Survival replaced ambition. For those who had known security, the fall was especially cruel. Former executives begged on street corners. College graduates scrubbed floors. Children left school to take whatever odd jobs they could find. Dignity, once taken for granted, became a quiet casualty. And through it all, there was a shared understanding. Something had broken, not just in banks or factories, but in the promise of the American system itself. The land of opportunity now looked like a land of hunger. Yet even in the darkest hours, there were glimmers of solidarity. Neighbors shared what little they had. Communities pooled resources. Churches opened their doors. Though the pain was widespread, so too was the will to endure. This was no ordinary recession. It was an unraveling of life as people knew it. The question on every face was the same. How long will this last? And what will be left when it's over? While cities grappled with unemployment and hunger, a different catastrophe was unfolding in the American heartland. In Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico, the land itself was dying. What began as drought escalated into one of the worst environmental disasters in U.S. history, the Dust Bowl. For decades, farmers had plowed the prairie flat, stripping away native grasses that held the soil in place. In wet years, the earth yielded abundant crops. But those grasses had served a vital purpose. They trapped moisture and anchored the soil against the wind. When the rain stopped in the early 1930s and the sun baked the earth dry, the topsoil turned to dust. Then came the wind. Massive dust storms, some hundreds of miles wide, rolled across the plains like black walls. They swallowed farms whole, silenced livestock, and turned midday into midnight. Dust seeped through window cracks under doors into lungs. Children coughed up dirt. Cattle choked to death. Crops withered before they could sprout. Families tried to hold on, but many reached a breaking point. Piling their belongings into rickety trucks and sedans, entire communities fled west toward California, chasing rumors of work and mercy. They became known as Okies, regardless of where they'd actually come from, and they found little welcome at the end of their journey. Instead of opportunity, they often met suspicion, low wages, and overcrowded labor camps. Their exodus wasn't just a migration. It was a testament to desperation, resilience, and the enduring hope that somewhere, someone might see their humanity. And in time, their stories, like Eleanor Roosevelt's, would help shape a nation's conscience. The golden dream of California often turned out to be just another field, another grueling day picking fruit for pennies, and another night sleeping under the open sky. The promise of abundance was mostly myth, replaced by overcrowded labor camps, backbreaking work, and wages that barely covered a meal. Photographers like Dorothea Lange captured the raw despair in images that would sear themselves into the nation's memory. Mothers with sun-weathered faces, barefoot children clinging to their arms, eyes fixed on a future that offered no guarantees. Writers like John Steinbeck gave these displaced families a voice in The Grapes of Wrath, portraying their quiet endurance with dignity and fury. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a human-made tragedy. Decades of aggressive plowing driven by short-term profit and the belief that the land was endlessly bountiful had stripped away the native grasses that held the soil together. When drought hit, the earth turned to dust and the wind carried it away by the ton. The storms were more than environmental. They became storms of identity, belonging, and purpose. For families who had tilled the same soil for generations, the betrayal felt personal. The land they loved had turned against them, and so they kept moving. Some never looked back. As the crisis deepened, President Herbert Hoover clung to his belief in limited government. A man shaped by self-reliance and private enterprise, he trusted that the economy would correct itself with time and optimism. He urged voluntary efforts from charities and local authorities, wary that federal aid would breed dependency and weaken the American spirit. But by 1932, the scale of suffering had outgrown goodwill. Crops rotted in fields with no markets. Factories stood silent. Millions went hungry. Then came one of the most haunting episodes of the era. Over 20,000 World War I veterans, men who had fought for their country, marched on Washington in 1932, peacefully demanding early payment of bonuses promised for their service. With no money and nowhere to go, they built a makeshift camp near the Capitol and waited. Hoover refused to meet them. When tensions rose, he ordered the U.S. Army to clear the encampment. General Douglas MacArthur, with cavalry and even tanks, drove out the unarmed veterans, burning their tents and scattering families into the night. Photographs of American heroes being attacked by their own government shocked the nation and crystallized public disillusionment. People began renaming their hardship in bitter irony. Shantytowns became Hoovervilles. Empty pockets turned inside out were Hoover flags, cardboard patches and worn-out shoes, Hoover leather. These weren't just jokes. They were quiet pleas for recognition, signs that the country had lost faith in its leadership. Hoover may not have been cruel in intent, but in a moment that demanded bold action, his rigidity felt like abandonment. By the 1932 election, it was clear America needed more than reassurance. It needed a new direction. And rising to meet that need was a voice both familiar and refreshingly bold. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On a cold March day in 1933, FDR's calm, steady voice filled living rooms across the country. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. In that single sentence, he offered what millions hadn't felt in years: hope. Franklin Roosevelt was unlike any president before him. Though paralyzed by polio since 1921, he radiated strength, warmth, and resolve. He didn't wait for consensus or gradual recovery. Within his first 100 days, he launched an unprecedented wave of action. He declared a national bank holiday, closing all banks to stop the panic. When they reopened, Americans, reassured by his leadership, returned not to withdraw, but to deposit. Confidence began to return. He called his bold agenda the New Deal, a sweeping set of programs designed not just to rescue the economy, but to restore dignity. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, gave young unemployed men jobs building trails, planting trees, and conserving forests. They lived in camps, sent money home, and found pride in blistered hands and honest work. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, put millions more to work building schools, roads, bridges, and also employed artists, writers, and musicians. Murals adorned post offices, plays filled town squares, and oral historians preserved the voices of formerly enslaved people before they were lost to time. For the first time, the federal government acknowledged that people mattered as much as markets. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for the elderly and unemployed. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, guaranteed bank deposits so no one would lose their life savings again. Farmers received subsidies and support through the Agricultural Adjustment Act, offering a fragile but vital lifeline after years of dust and drought. Roosevelt spoke directly to the people through his fireside chats, radio broadcasts that turned policy into plain, comforting conversation. Families gathered around their radios as if listening to a trusted friend. He didn't speak over their heads. He spoke with them. Of course, the New Deal wasn't perfect. It moved slowly for some and too fast for others. Racial discrimination excluded many Black Americans from its full benefits. Women, too, often found themselves sidelined. Yet for a nation paralyzed by despair, it offered something revolutionary: motion. Not just economic motion, but moral motion. The sense that the country hadn't forgotten its people. Jobs rebuilt more than infrastructure. They rebuilt identity. A man with a paycheck, even from planting trees, was no longer just a statistic. He was a provider, a participant, a citizen again. Communities began to heal, not through grand pronouncements, but through the daily rhythm of shared purpose. But the New Deal also stirred fierce debate. Conservatives, especially in business and finance, accused Roosevelt of veering toward socialism. They warned that expanded government would destroy free enterprise and personal freedom. Newspapers painted him as a would-be dictator, his fireside chats a tool of manipulation. Meanwhile, on the left, figures like Louisiana Senator Huey Long argued that the New Deal didn't go far enough. Long championed a Share Our Wealth program, promising to cap personal fortunes and guarantee every family a minimum income. Others demanded more radical redistribution, faster relief, deeper change. FDR navigated this storm with political skill, adjusting course when needed but never losing sight of his core belief. That government had a moral duty to protect its most vulnerable. The New Deal wasn't a cure-all. It didn't end the Depression overnight. That would take World War II. But it redefined the relationship between the American people and their government. It planted the idea that fairness, security, and human dignity were not luxuries, but rights, and through it all, standing quietly but firmly beside Roosevelt, often ahead of him, was Eleanor. She visited CCC camps, WPA sites, and sharecropper shacks, bringing back stories the president might never have heard otherwise. She pushed him to be bolder on civil rights, more inclusive in relief efforts, more attuned to the voices on the margins. In many ways, she was the New Deal's moral compass, ensuring that its promise reached beyond policy papers and into the lives of real people. The Great Depression tested America's soul. But in its darkest hours, it also revealed the nation's capacity for reinvention, compassion, and collective will. And at the heart of that transformation stood a president who dared to act, and a first lady who refused to look away. Senator Huey Long of Louisiana proposed a Share Our Wealth program that shook the political landscape. He demanded steep taxes on the rich to fund guaranteed incomes, housing, and education for all Americans. His speeches, fiery, emotional, and laced with populist rage, drew enormous crowds and threatened to peel away support from Roosevelt's New Deal coalition. Long's message resonated deeply in a country still reeling from inequality and despair. Though he was assassinated in 1935, his ideas didn't die with him. They lingered in the air, picked up by labor organizers, reformers, and future policymakers who believed the nation owed more to its working people. Another powerful critic was Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest whose radio sermons reached millions. Initially a supporter of FDR, Coughlin grew disillusioned and turned sharply against him, accusing the president of being a pawn of bankers who had betrayed the working class. His broadcasts began as economic critiques but soon spiraled into dangerous territory, weaving anti-Semitic conspiracy theories into his message. Coughlin's rise revealed the volatile undercurrents of public anger, how economic pain could be twisted into scapegoating and fear. The New Deal also faced institutional resistance. In 1935, the Supreme Court struck down key pieces of Roosevelt's agenda, ruling agencies like the National Recovery Administration unconstitutional. It was a devastating setback. In response, FDR proposed a bold and controversial plan: to expand the court by adding up to 6 new justices who might be more sympathetic to his programs, a move critics derided as court packing. Though the plan ultimately failed in Congress, it created enough political pressure that the court soon began upholding New Deal legislation. The shift, later dubbed the switch in time that saved 9, marked a turning point in the balance of federal power. Even within his own administration, Roosevelt navigated constant tension between idealists who wanted faster, deeper reform and cautious advisors wary of overreach. Yet through it all, FDR held steady to one core belief, that government should serve as a stabilizing force in people's lives, not a distant bureaucracy. For every critic shouting on the radio or editorial page, there was a mother receiving her first Social Security check, a young man planting trees with the CCC, or a farmer who finally kept his land thanks to federal aid. The New Deal wasn't perfect. It excluded many, moved too slowly for some, too fast for others, but to millions. It was the difference between survival and ruin, and even in the depths of hardship, Americans found ways to express their humanity. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic collapse. It sparked a cultural renaissance. Under New Deal programs like the Farm Security Administration, photographers fanned out across the country, capturing the raw truth of daily life. Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, a gaunt woman with children clinging to her, her eyes lined with worry yet blazing with resolve, became an enduring symbol of the era. These images didn't just document suffering, they dignified it, reminding the nation that behind every statistic was a human being with a story. Writers, too, gave voice to the voiceless. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath followed the Joad family's exodus from the Dust Bowl to California, transforming fiction into a moral indictment of indifference. Meanwhile, authors like Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston explored the intersections of race, poverty, and identity in a fractured America. The Federal Writers Project, part of the WPA, employed thousands of writers to document oral histories, interview formerly enslaved people, and create state-by-state guides that celebrated regional voices. For a rare moment in history, the U.S. government paid people not just to build roads, but to tell stories. Music echoed the same spirit. Folk singer Woody Guthrie turned hardship into poetry, writing ballads about dust storms, unemployment, and working-class resilience. His guitar famously bore the words, "This machine kills fascists." Songs like "This Land Is Your Land" became anthems, not just of protest, but of shared belonging. And in darkened movie theaters, Americans found temporary refuge. For a few cents, they could lose themselves in the grace of Fred Astaire, the wit of Charlie Chaplin, or the technicolor magic of Dorothy's Journey to Oz. Films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington reminded audiences that courage and integrity still mattered. In a time of scarcity, the arts weren't a luxury, they were survival. They kept imagination alive when everything else felt barren. By the late 1930s, the worst panic of the Depression had eased. The New Deal had restored a measure of stability, and the American spirit had proven remarkably resilient. But full recovery remained elusive. Unemployment stayed high, wages were low, and many families were just treading water. Then came the unthinkable, war. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, the U.S. initially stayed neutral, but its factories began humming again, producing arms and supplies for Allied nations. Jobs returned, and after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, America plunged fully into the conflict. The transformation was immediate and total. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Millions of men joined the military, and millions of women, epitomized by Rosie the Riveter, stepped into roles once deemed unthinkable. The war effort did what the New Deal alone could not. It ended the Depression. Unemployment vanished. Paychecks returned. For the first time in over a decade, the future felt bright. But the lessons of the 1930s endured. Americans had learned how fragile prosperity could be, how dangerous unchecked inequality was, and how vital safety nets truly were. Social Security remained. Labor protections held. The idea that government had a responsibility to protect the vulnerable had taken root in the national conscience. The Depression had reshaped not just policy but perspective. It taught a generation humility, mutual aid, and perseverance. And as the nation marched into a new era, stronger, wiser, but forever marked. It carried with it the memory of breadlines, dust storms, and the quiet dignity of those who never stopped hoping. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452, not into wealth or nobility, but into quiet obscurity. He was the illegitimate son of a Florentine notary and a peasant woman, raised in the rolling hills of Tuscany in the small village of Vinci. There would be no formal university education for him, no privileged path into the intellectual elite. Yet Leonardo possessed something far rarer than pedigree, an insatiable, almost sacred curiosity about how the world worked. From the moment he could hold a pen, he watched the world with wonder. A dragonfly hovering over a pond, the spiral of a seashell, the way storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Nothing was too small to escape his notice. He didn't just observe. He questioned, dissected, and drew. And then he wrote it all down. His notebooks began as humble scraps, marginalia on reused paper, quick sketches of water ripples or bird wings. But over time, they grew into vast, swirling encyclopedias of thought. These weren't books meant for publication. They had no titles, no editors, no audience. They were his private laboratories, spaces where ideas could breathe, collide, and evolve. Across thousands of pages, Leonardo explored flight, anatomy, hydraulics, optics, painting, engineering, botany, and geology, not as separate subjects, but as threads of a single, interconnected tapestry. To Leonardo, the veins in a human hand mirrored the branching of a river delta, or the veins of a leaf. Art and science weren't opposites. They were twin languages describing the same divine order. He asked questions that seemed fantastical for his time. Can humans fly? How does the heart pump blood? Why do waves form? What moves the stars? And for every answer he uncovered, 10 new questions bloomed, each one captured in hurried sketches, annotated diagrams, and notes written in his now famous mirror script. That script, flowing right to left, legible only with a mirror, has fascinated scholars for centuries. Some say it was to keep his ideas secret. Others believe it was simply how his left-handed mind worked most naturally. Whatever the reason, it adds to the sense that these pages were intimate, almost confessional, Leonardo thinking aloud to himself across time. He carried these notebooks everywhere, from the workshops of Florence to the courts of Milan, from military encampments to quiet countryside studios. They were his truest companions. And through them, he wasn't just recording the world, he was learning how to see it more deeply, more truthfully, more beautifully. In those pages, we don't just glimpse the mind of a genius. We witness the birth of modern inquiry itself, a mind unbound by categories, forever asking, why? Was Leonardo protecting his ideas? Was his mirror writing a code, a deliberate act of concealment, or simply the practical habit of a left-handed man who found it easier to write from right to left, to avoid smudging the ink? The truth is likely a blend of all these things. Perhaps it was instinctive, perhaps intentional, perhaps both. What's certain is that this reversed script adds to the notebook's haunting allure, turning them into something more than journals. They feel like portals, windows into the private engine room of a mind centuries ahead of its time. Leonardo didn't write for an audience. His pages are alive with scattered thoughts, sudden insights, unfinished experiments, and questions that loop back on themselves. He might begin with a sketch of a bird in flight, then leap to a design for a water pump, followed by a reflection on how light bends through glass. There's no table of contents, no neat filing system, because his mind didn't work that way. His thinking was fluid, nonlinear, spiraling outward like ripples on water. The notebooks mirror the beautiful chaos of true curiosity, and what fills those pages is nothing short of astonishing. Notes on how to track the sun's movement using shadows. Studies of human laughter, not just the muscles involved, but the emotion behind it. Lists of books to read, people to interview, machines to imagine. He once wrote, described the tongue of a woodpecker. That detail, so precise, so oddly specific, reveals the depth of his attention. He didn't just want to know the world in broad strokes. He wanted to understand every hidden mechanism, every overlooked wonder. There's also a striking beauty in the handwriting itself. Elegant, flowing, dancing between sketches of muscles, gears, and cloud formations. His lines aren't merely functional. They vibrate with motion and intent, as if each stroke carries the energy of discovery. Most fascinating of all, Leonardo never explained his mirror writing. He left no key, no note clarifying his method. He simply wrote, privately, passionately, relentlessly. To open one of his notebooks is to stand at the edge of a mind in motion, spinning, questioning, sketching its way toward understanding. And for those willing to read backward, to lean in, to look closely, the reward isn't just answers. It's something far more valuable, the pure, unfiltered spirit of inquiry. Not the conclusion, but the question itself. Centuries before the Wright brothers lifted into the sky, before submarines glided beneath ocean waves or robots assembled cars on factory floors, Leonardo da Vinci was sketching machines the world had never seen and could scarcely imagine. His notebooks overflow with inventions that read like science fiction. A helicopter-like aerial screw powered by a spiral rotor, an armored tank with angled plating and rotating cannons, a mechanical knight capable of sitting, waving its arms and moving its jaw, devices for grinding lenses, lifting water, and weaving cloth. Leonardo wasn't an inventor in the modern sense. He rarely built what he designed. But his grasp of mechanics, motion, and force was rooted in deep observation. He studied pulleys and olive presses, gears and clocks, and the way water turned mill wheels. Then he asked, what else could this do? His aerial screw was based on the idea that air, like water, could be pushed and shaped. Though no engine of his era could power it, the principle was sound. His armored vehicle, drawn like a spiked turtle, was as much about psychological warfare as battlefield strategy, designed to terrify as much as to protect. But Leonardo didn't only dream of war. He envisioned tools for peace, irrigation canals, self-supporting bridges, mechanical looms to ease labor. His drawings often included not just form, but function, notes on torque, balance, energy flow. Yet most of these machines remained on paper. The materials weren't strong enough. The power sources didn't exist. The world simply wasn't ready, but that never deterred him. For Leonardo, imagining was a form of building. His notebooks weren't blueprints for his time. They were letters to the future, written in ink and hope. And today, engineers and designers still pore over his pages, not just for what they contain, but for how they think. In those unrealized machines, Leonardo reminds us that ideas can outlive their moment, waiting patiently for the world to catch up. In an age when dissecting the human body was taboo, often illegal, even dangerous, Leonardo da Vinci quietly, courageously pulled back the skin and revealed what lay beneath. To him, the body wasn't something to fear or revere from afar. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a divine machine worthy of study. And in his notebooks, that study unfolds with breathtaking precision. His anatomical drawings are among the most accurate ever made by hand, rivaling modern medical illustrations. Working in secrecy, often at night by candlelight, he performed autopsies on both humans and animals, translating each discovery into ink. He mapped the skeleton not just as structure, but as a dynamic system, measuring how the pelvis tilts, how joints rotate, how the spine bears weight. He traced muscles and tendons like a sculptor and an engineer in one, showing how motion flows from thought to action. He went deeper still. He drew the brain, the nerves, the chambers of the heart, not as symbols, but as functional organs. He was the first to correctly describe how heart valves work, using wax to cast their intricate shapes. He even hypothesized that the heart acted as a double pump, circulating blood in a closed loop, a concept that wouldn't be fully accepted for another century. He sketched fetuses in the womb, cross-sections of skulls, the delicate folds of the lungs, all with a tenderness that transcended science. These weren't morbid fascinations. They were acts of reverence. For Leonardo, to understand the body was to glimpse the mind of the Creator. Tragically, almost none of this work was published in his lifetime. His anatomical insights lay hidden in notebooks, unseen by physicians who might have advanced medicine by decades. It's one of history's quiet heartbreaks, knowledge that arrived too soon, yet what survives is extraordinary. Through ink and observation, Leonardo turned flesh into wisdom. He didn't just draw the body, he honored it. And in doing so, he revealed a profound truth: that beauty isn't just surface. It's structural, mechanical, miraculous. To Leonardo, nature wasn't scenery, it was the blueprint of existence. His notebooks overflow with awe for the natural world. He saw no divide between the curve of a river and the arch of a spine, between the branching of a tree and the veins in a hand. Everything was connected by invisible laws of form and flow. He spent hours watching water, how it swirled, eddied, and surged. Entire pages are filled with studies of currents, which he compared to the swirl of hair, the shape of clouds, even the movement of wind. Water has limbs and breath, he wrote. When he drew it, it didn't look like liquid. It looked alive, a language of motion. Plants captivated him too. He sketched leaves down to their finest veins, noting how they mirrored river deltas. He observed sunflowers tracking the sun, vines reaching for light, roots gripping soil. To him, even a blade of grass was an expression of geometry, balance, and light. He found order in apparent chaos, the spiral of a snail's shell, the chambers of a pomegranate, the flight path of a bird, all following hidden harmonies. He studied proportion not just in the human body, but in animals, mountains, trees, and architecture. His famous Vitruvian Man wasn't merely an anatomical drawing. It was a meditation on the idea that the human form embodies the same ratios found in temples, landscapes, and the cosmos itself. That we are, in essence, microcosms of the universe. For Leonardo, nature was both teacher and muse, and through his eyes we learn that to truly see the world is not just to look, but to wonder, to question, and to connect everything to everything else. It was about harmony. Leonardo's Vitruvian Man wasn't just a study of anatomy. It was his attempt to show that the human body itself reflected the architecture of the universe. Every proportion, every symmetry echoed cosmic order. Even weather patterns fascinated him. He tried to map the structure of storms, chart the invisible currents of wind, and decode the turbulence of air and sea. His sketches of crashing waves and swirling clouds reveal more than scientific curiosity. They radiate artistic awe. Leonardo didn't seek to dominate nature. He wanted to understand it deeply enough to collaborate with it. He believed beauty wasn't merely pleasing to the eye. It was functional. Every curve in a leaf, every ripple in water, every arch in a bone served a purpose. And by learning to see the world as nature does, through patterns, flows, and relationships, he believed we could create better art, build wiser machines, and live more thoughtfully. In his notebooks, nature isn't a subject to be painted or dissected. It's the ultimate teacher, and Leonardo was its most devoted student. To many, Leonardo is remembered first as a painter, the genius behind The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. But what made his art revolutionary wasn't just his brushwork. It was the science behind the surface. His notebooks reveal that every painting was the culmination of relentless study. He didn't just depict what he saw, he painted what he understood. Before rendering a face, he dissected muscles and mapped how they shaped expression. Before painting a landscape, he studied geology, optics, and the physics of light. Shadow and perspective weren't just stylistic choices, they were mathematical problems to be solved. He believed emotion lived in the smallest details, the tilt of a brow, the tension in a hand, the subtle parting of lips. His notebooks overflow with sketches of laughter, grief, suspicion, and serenity, each drawn with the precision of a scientist and the sensitivity of a poet. For The Last Supper, he choreographed every figure like a director. He mapped gestures, postures, and reactions to Christ's words, "One of you will betray me." Each apostle's body language tells a story. Some recoil in shock. Others lean in denial. One clutches a bag of silver. It's not a static image. It's a moment of human drama frozen in time, designed to pull the viewer into the emotional core of the scene. Then there's the Mona Lisa, perhaps the most enigmatic face in art history. Her smile isn't magic. It's mastery. Leonardo used sfumato, blending tones so softly that edges vanish, mimicking how the human eye perceives reality. Her gaze seems to follow you not through illusion, but through careful manipulation of light and shadow. Her expression shifts with your angle, with the room's brightness, as if she's breathing, thinking, responding. It's a portrait engineered to live. For Leonardo, painting was the final performance of a long rehearsal, where science, observation, and imagination converged. Every masterpiece was a solution to a complex puzzle of light, motion, balance, and truth. And in his notebooks, we see the equations behind the elegance. But Leonardo wasn't only a thinker, he was also a playful soul. Tucked between diagrams of flying machines and anatomical studies are riddles, wordplay, and whimsical notes. He wrote cryptic phrases like, "The sun has never seen a shadow," a poetic truth, since a light source cannot cast a shadow on itself, wrapped in mystery. He posed riddles. Describe a creature who walks backward while eating. The answer? A chicken, scratching the ground behind it as it pecks. His margins teem with hybrid creatures, dragons with mechanical limbs, winged lions, armored beasts, some likely studies of anatomy in disguise, others fragments of dreams or theatrical designs. These weren't distractions from his serious work. They were part of it. Leonardo thought sideways. He thrived in the space between logic and imagination, where paradox deepened understanding. Why the mirror writing? The puzzles? The fragmented thoughts? Some say he guarded his ideas from rivals or the church. Others believe he simply wrote for himself. His notebooks a private dialogue with the universe. Yet these riddles feel like invitations. They ask, can you see what I see? Can you wonder as I wonder? Leonardo is estimated to have filled over 13,000 pages in his lifetime. Today, only about 7,000 survive. The rest are lost, scattered, sold, stolen, or turned to dust. After his death in 1519, his papers passed to his devoted student Francesco Melzi, who tried to preserve them. But over time, the collection fractured. Some notebooks were gifted to kings. Others were cut apart for their drawings. The Codex Atlanticus, the largest surviving compilation, was once nearly forgotten in a Milanese library. The Codex Leicester, filled with studies of water, light, and astronomy, was bought by Bill Gates in 1994 and later digitized for the world. But many volumes referenced by Leonardo himself, on optics, flight, painting, are still missing. Perhaps they lie hidden in an unmarked box in a European archive waiting to be found. What have we lost? Machines that might have reshaped history. Insights that predated modern science by centuries. Ideas too bold for their time, patiently waiting in silence. Yet what remains is enough to ignite wonder anew. Every rediscovered page feels like hearing Leonardo's voice again, curious, soft, endlessly questioning. The gaps in his legacy aren't just absences. They're openings, invitations to keep exploring, imagining, and asking. Because what Leonardo left behind wasn't a finished doctrine. It was a trail of breadcrumbs leading into the unknown. He died in 1519 in the quiet service of the King of France, far from the bustling streets of Florence and Milan that once pulsed with Renaissance energy. He left no children, no formal school, no single book that summed up his vision. Instead, he left thousands of pages filled with sketches, questions, riddles, and half-formed dreams. A lifelong conversation with the universe, written in mirrored script. Those notebooks have outlived empires. They whisper across centuries, not with final answers, but with endless curiosity. They remind us that to Leonardo, the world was never complete. It was always unfolding, always teaching, always inviting us to look again. Today, his flying machines echo in helicopters and drones. His anatomical studies still astonish medical students. His insights into light, water, and proportion guide artists and engineers alike. And his core belief, that art and science are partners, not rivals, feels urgently relevant in our own age of fragmentation. Leonardo didn't write for fame. He rarely published. He scribbled in margins, tested ideas without knowing if they'd work, and followed his questions wherever they led. He wasn't driven by perfection, but by pursuit. Not by mastery, but by wonder, and that perhaps is his greatest gift. In a world that craves certainty, Leonardo reminds us of the beauty of not knowing, of leaning into mystery, observing more closely, asking more deeply, and imagining more boldly. His notebooks aren't relics. They're living invitations. Open one, and you can still feel his presence. A mind alive on the page, drawing, thinking, dreaming. A mind that believed the world was too intricate, too miraculous to ever be fully understood, but that we must try anyway. Leonardo da Vinci didn't leave us a final theory. He left us an open notebook, and with it, a simple instruction. Look closer. Ludwig van Beethoven was born in December 1770 in Bonn, a modest city nestled along the Rhine River in what is now Germany. He entered a world already heavy with expectation. His father, Johann, was a singer at the court chapel, and a man fixated on molding his son into a child prodigy like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But unlike Mozart's gentle, nurturing upbringing, Beethoven's early years were marked by hardship. Johann was strict, often harsh, and increasingly dependent on alcohol. When Ludwig was just a boy, his father would yank him from bed in the middle of the night and force him to practice piano until his fingers ached and his eyelids drooped with exhaustion. There were no lullabies, only scales, etudes, and sharp corrections. This wasn't guidance. It was a demand for brilliance. And yet, within that pressure, something extraordinary began to blossom. Young Beethoven absorbed music as naturally as breath. He listened, not just to notes, but to the world around him. The chime of church bells, the rhythm of footsteps on cobblestone, the murmur of voices in the market. The piano, though a source of fear and fatigue, also became his refuge, a place where his emotions could speak freely, away from his father's shouting and the chaos of home. By age 12, he was publishing his first compositions. By 14, he was appointed organist at the court. He had little formal education, but he possessed something far rarer: raw instinct, searing intensity, and an imagination that refused to be tamed. He was a quiet, often lonely child, misunderstood by those around him. But in music he found stability, not entertainment, but sanctuary. When his mother died during his teenage years, the responsibility of caring for his two younger brothers fell to him. His father sank deeper into alcoholism, and Ludwig, still a boy himself, became the reluctant head of a crumbling household. Through it all he kept composing, kept playing, kept dreaming. Beethoven's early life wasn't gilded with privilege or guided by wise mentors. It was forged in hardship, discipline, and a desperate need to express what he could not say in words. And in that crucible of silence and pressure, the spark of genius began to burn, not with polish, but with fire. Long before the world would fall silent around him, Beethoven had already learned to hear with more than his ears. He had learned to feel music. When Beethoven arrived in Vienna at the age of 21, the city was alive with sound and spirit. It was the cultural heart of Europe, its streets humming with melody, its salons buzzing with intellectual fervor. The greats, Mozart, Haydn, Salieri, had all walked its cobbled lanes. For Beethoven, this wasn't just a change of scenery. It was a rebirth. Vienna didn't welcome him as a refined gentleman, but as a wild, untamed force. Tousled hair, intense eyes, and a temperament as fiery as his playing. He had no patience for flattering the aristocracy with small talk. He let his music speak, and it roared. At the piano, he would improvise entire worlds, tender, tempestuous, transcendent, often with eyes closed, as if channeling something beyond human reach. Audiences were left breathless. He studied briefly with Joseph Haydn, though their relationship was strained. Beethoven respected the master, but he refused to be his echo. He wasn't interested in perfecting tradition. He wanted to shatter it open. Where others polished elegance, he injected raw emotion. He took classical forms and bent them, twisted them, exploded them from within. Vienna's elite took notice. Patrons offered him lodgings, commissions, connections. But Beethoven accepted support only on his own terms. He cherished independence above all. "There is no greater wealth," he once said, "than to live without servitude." As his reputation grew, so did his ambition. He wasn't writing for courtly approval or popular acclaim. He was writing for truth. Every sonata, every symphony became a map of his inner world, a conversation with his own soul. His early works dazzled with their blend of discipline and storm, of order and rebellion. But beneath the applause, something ominous stirred. A faint ringing in his ears. At first he ignored it, a passing nuisance. But it wouldn't fade. Conversations in crowded rooms became muffled. High notes lost their clarity. The very music that defined him began to slip away. By his late 20s, Beethoven faced the unthinkable. He was going deaf. For a composer, this wasn't just a medical condition. It was a spiritual crisis. Music was his voice, his identity, his connection to the world. Without it, who was he? He kept his condition secret, ashamed and terrified of pity. He withdrew from society, grew irritable, isolated. Friends sensed his pain but didn't understand its source. In private letters and diary fragments, he poured out his anguish. "Oh, how humiliating," he wrote. "When someone standing next to me hears a flute in the distance and I hear nothing." Yet, even as the outer world grew silent, the music inside him grew louder, more urgent, more vivid. He began composing not for audiences but for survival. Every note became an act of defiance against the encroaching void. He no longer needed to hear an instrument to know its voice. His understanding of harmony, rhythm, and structure ran so deep that he could compose entire symphonies in his mind. His deafness didn't silence his genius, it distilled it. And what he lost in sound, he gained in depth, and the silence that once terrified him would soon become the canvas for his most profound creations. In the autumn of 1802, Beethoven retreated to the village of Heiligenstadt, just outside Vienna, on doctor's orders to rest and find peace in the countryside. But peace eluded him. Surrounded by rustling leaves and birdsong he could barely perceive, he was confronted with the full weight of his despair. There, in solitude, he wrote a letter to his brothers, a raw, heart-wrenching document he never sent. Today, it's known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. In it, Beethoven confessed everything: his shame, his isolation, the unbearable irony of a musician losing his hearing. He admitted to thoughts of suicide, not out of weakness, but from the crushing belief that his life's purpose was gone. But then, in the depths of his sorrow, came a turning point. "Only my art held me back," he wrote. The music inside him, unwritten, unplayed, but fiercely alive, was reason enough to go on. He realized he could not die, not yet. He still had truths to tell, symphonies to unleash, a legacy to forge. After drafting the testament, Beethoven returned to Vienna transformed. He had stared into the abyss and chosen creation over surrender. From that moment on, he composed not to please, but to reveal. His music grew bolder, more emotional, more revolutionary. He stopped imitating the past and began building the future. The Heiligenstadt Testament was never mailed, but it remains one of the most human documents ever penned by a genius. A testament not to despair, but to the power of art to redeem it. And then, Beethoven roared. What followed was one of the most astonishing creative surges in history. Though his hearing continued to fade, his vision expanded. He composed with a newfound intensity, writing from a realm beyond the physical. His Third Symphony, the Eroica, heroic, marked this turning point. It was longer, grander, and more emotionally complex than any symphony before it, a declaration of artistic independence, a monument to human struggle and triumph. Originally dedicated to Napoleon, Beethoven famously scratched out the dedication when the French leader declared himself emperor, crying, "Now he too will trample on the rights of man." The Eroica wasn't just music. It was a manifesto, and it signaled the birth of Beethoven's middle period, a time when he redefined what music could be. In the years that followed, he poured his resilience, his fury, his hope into sonatas, concertos, and symphonies that spoke not just to listeners, but to the human condition itself. His deafness deepened, yet his output soared. He used conversation books to communicate, placing a pencil on the piano to feel vibrations, composing through memory, mathematics, and sheer will. By the time he wrote his Ninth Symphony, with its triumphant Ode to Joy, he was almost completely deaf. At its premiere, he had to be turned around to see the audience's thunderous applause, because he couldn't hear it, but he didn't need to. Because Beethoven had long since learned that true music isn't heard with the ears, it's felt in the soul. And in the silence, he found not emptiness, but eternity. It broke all the rules. Originally dedicated to Napoleon, whom Beethoven admired as a champion of liberty, he tore off the dedication in fury when Napoleon crowned himself emperor. To Beethoven, this wasn't just a political betrayal. It was a moral one. From then on, the Eroica was no longer about a single hero. It became a hymn to humanity itself, its triumphs, its grief, its unyielding resilience. Every note pulsed with the weight of lived experience, as if Beethoven had forged a new musical language in the fires of personal and political disillusionment. Then came the Fifth Symphony, with its four-note opening that would echo through time. Da-da-da-dam! Beethoven called it fate knocking at the door. Stark, urgent, unforgettable. It didn't just begin a symphony. It launched a drama. In those four notes lay everything: question and answer, struggle and resolve, despair and defiance. It was as if Beethoven had compressed the entire arc of human existence into a single shattering gesture. Even now, centuries later, it thrums like a heartbeat, universal, primal, alive. These weren't merely beautiful arrangements. They were emotional manifestos. Beethoven was no longer composing for concerts or commissions. He was writing from the core of his being, from a realm beyond sound. He could no longer hear music as others did, but he knew how it felt. His mind had become its own concert hall, where every vibration, every harmony resonated with absolute clarity. While others wrote for salons and courts, Beethoven composed for the human soul. He shattered boundaries of form and harmony, filling his works with jarring contrasts, rage and serenity, thunder and whisper, chaos and order. Beneath it all pulsed a constant theme, the struggle of a man wrestling with fate, with silence, with the limits of his own body, and transcending them through sheer creative will. His deafness, once a source of shame, had become a threshold. It led him into a deeper world, one few could access, and through his music, he invited us all to follow. By the time Beethoven entered his final decade, his outer world had grown quiet. His deafness was nearly total. Conversation required notebooks. His health faltered. His finances wavered. Many of his closest friends had died. But inwardly, his mind burned brighter than ever. From this solitude emerged his late style, music unlike anything the world had heard. Introspective, spiritual, mysterious. These final works weren't meant to dazzle audiences. They were inner dialogues, prayers without words, questions without answers. His late piano sonatas drifted far from tradition. One moment featherlight, the next erupting in sudden fury. He'd linger on a single note like a breath held too long, then leap into a phrase that seemed to chase a thought just out of reach. He wasn't following musical rules anymore. He was following feeling. Even more astonishing were his late string quartets, pieces that baffled his contemporaries and still challenge musicians today. Their structures twist and unfold like dreams. Melodies arrive as whispers from the past. Pauses stretch into silence that speaks louder than sound. In the Cavatina from Opus 130, Beethoven wrote the word beklemmt, oppressed, choked with emotion. When played, it feels like a heart remembering a sorrow too deep for words. These weren't concert pieces. They were letters to eternity. Beethoven, unable to hear the world, writing for something beyond it. Many at the time were perplexed. Some thought he'd lost his mind. Others didn't know what to make of the strange harmonies, the abrupt silences, the profound sadness woven into every phrase. But Beethoven never explained. He didn't need to. "What I have in my heart," he once said, "must come out. That is the reason why I compose." And in these final years, that truth blazed with unmatched intensity. His late works weren't swan songs. They were meditations, acts of courage from a man who had nothing left to prove and everything left to feel. By the early 1820s, Beethoven was completely deaf. He could no longer hear laughter, conversation, or even his own footsteps. And yet, from the heart of that vast silence, he composed what many regard as the greatest symphony ever written, the Ninth. It was revolutionary in every sense, not only in its scale, but in its very design. For the first time in history, a symphony would end not with instruments alone, but with the human voice. Beethoven chose Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, a poem celebrating universal brotherhood beneath the stars. He had carried its vision for decades. Now, in the twilight of his life, he gave it sound. Sound he could not hear, but could still feel in his bones. The Ninth is a journey. The first three movements surge with conflict, beauty, and tension, like oceans stirred by unseen storms. Then comes the finale, an explosion of light. Cellos and basses introduce the theme, low, solemn, rising like a voice finding its strength. The orchestra joins, and then, at last, the chorus enters. O Freunde, nicht diese Töne. Oh friends, not these sounds. What follows is a hymn so pure, so radiant with hope, that it has become an anthem for humanity, sung at the fall of the Berlin Wall, at Olympic ceremonies, in moments when the world dares to believe in unity. At the premiere in Vienna in 1824, Beethoven stood near the stage, unaware the performance had ended. He couldn't hear the thunderous applause. A soprano gently turned him around so he could see the crowd on their feet, weeping, cheering. He saw the ovation, but he didn't hear it. And yet he had heard it where it mattered most, in the chamber of his soul. The Ninth Symphony wasn't just music. It was a triumph over silence, a declaration that joy, even in darkness, even in isolation, is always worth singing. On March 26, 1827, Ludwig van Beethoven took his final breath. Outside, a storm raged over Vienna. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled like timpani. Some say he raised his fist toward the heavens one last time, as if challenging fate itself. Others say he passed quietly, as he had lived for so long, in silence. Either way, the world lost a titan. Tens of thousands gathered for his funeral, students, aristocrats, musicians, strangers, all drawn by the gravity of his life's work. As his casket moved through the streets of Vienna, the city fell into a hush. Not out of protocol, but out of awe. Beethoven left behind more than symphonies and sonatas. He left a new philosophy of art, one that insists creation is born not from perfection, but from struggle. Not from ease, but from the courage to speak your truth, even when the world has gone silent. He taught us that music isn't just heard, it's felt, and that the deepest songs are often written in the quietest rooms. He had reshaped the very purpose of the composer, not as a servant to royal courts, aristocratic whims, or fashionable trends, but as a voice of the individual soul, unfiltered and unafraid. Beethoven proved that greatness doesn't require perfection, that even as his body failed him, his spirit soared higher. Silence didn't end him, it deepened him. He didn't write music despite his deafness. He wrote music through it, because of it. Future generations would study his scores like sacred texts. Johannes Brahms wept when trying to compose his own first symphony, haunted by the weight of Beethoven's legacy. Richard Wagner called him the bridge between the mortal and the divine. Others said that in every note he wrote, you could hear the pulse of the universe itself. And his influence stretches far beyond the concert hall. Modern filmmakers use his themes to evoke epic emotion. Jazz musicians quote his motifs. And rock legends like the Beatles and Muse have drawn inspiration from his revolutionary spirit. The Ninth Symphony became more than a masterpiece. It became a symbol of resilience in the face of despair, of unity across divides, of what the human spirit can achieve when it refuses to be silenced. Its ode to joy has sounded at moments of global reckoning, when the Berlin Wall fell, when nations signed peace treaties, when communities gathered to heal after tragedy. It has echoed in grand concert halls and humble school auditoriums alike, always carrying the same message: that joy is not naive, it is defiant. Beethoven never lived to see the full reach of his legacy. But perhaps he didn't need to. He once said, "Music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy." And in the cathedral of his silence, he had already spoken everything that mattered. The man who lost the world of sound gave us a world of meaning, and in doing so, became immortal. Beethoven's life is often remembered as a tragedy transformed into triumph, the deaf composer who gave the world its most powerful music. But his story is more than inspiration. It's a question that lingers in every listener's heart. How did he do it? How can someone hear music when there is no sound? The answer lies not in the ear, but in the imagination. By the time he wrote his final works, Beethoven could no longer hear a single note. Yet he composed entire symphonies, intricate quartets, and profound sonatas, pieces teeming with dynamic contrast, harmonic daring, and emotional nuance. He wasn't guessing how they might sound. He knew. Sound had become so deeply internalized that his mind could orchestrate every voice, every timbre, every swell and fade, as though his very bones had turned into an instrument. To feel the music physically, he would bite down on a wooden rod attached to his piano's soundboard, letting vibrations travel through his jawbone. He watched the strings tremble. He felt resonance in his chest. But more than that, he carried an inner library of sound. Every chord, every interval, every crescendo lived within him, not as memory, but as living truth. His compositions weren't echoes of the past. They were born in the present, forged in intuition, shaped by logic, and breathed into being by a musical intelligence that transcended the physical senses. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was a canvas, vast, still, and luminous. And on it he painted sound the way a blind painter might dream of color, not by seeing, but by knowing. Beethoven teaches us something essential about creativity. It doesn't bloom in comfort or perfect conditions. It rises from struggle, from persistence, from the refusal to abandon what is sacred, even when the world offers no audience, no applause, no assurance that anyone will ever understand. He reminds us that limitations do not define us. That hardship, when met with courage and vision, can become a doorway, not a barrier. To this day, When we listen to his music, we're not just hearing notes arranged in time. We're stepping into his world, a world where sound is shaped by silence, where joy rises from pain, where the most beautiful music ever written was never heard by the man who gave it to us, and perhaps that is Beethoven's final gift. Not just the notes on the page, but the quiet truth they carry, that some of the deepest, richest truths are not heard with the ear at all, but with the soul. Long after the storm clouds cleared over Vienna on that March day in 1827, long after the last mourner left his gravesite in the Waring Cemetery, something strange began to happen. Beethoven's silence did not settle like dust. It stirred. His manuscripts, scattered among publishers, students, and friends, began to circulate like whispered secrets. Some were incomplete, scraps of paper with smudged ink, pages torn from notebooks, sketches with arrows pointing nowhere. Others were dense with revisions, layers of thought stacked atop one another like geological strata. To those who dared to study them, it felt less like reading music and more like eavesdropping on a mind in motion. Furious, tender, relentless, one young composer, barely 20, traveled from Leipzig just to hold one of Beethoven's late quartet scores. He sat in a dim reading room for 3 days, barely eating, turning the pages so slowly it seemed he was afraid the notes might vanish. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. "It's not music," he whispered to no one in particular. "It's a confession," and perhaps that was the key. Beethoven hadn't just written symphonies. He had mapped the inner landscape of a soul under siege, by time, by fate, by the cruel irony of a body that failed its own genius. His late works didn't follow rules because he had outgrown them. He wasn't composing for ears anymore. He was composing for eternity, but eternity, as it turned out, had ears of its own. In the decades that followed, Beethoven's influence didn't fade, it mutated. It seeped into opera houses where Wagner dismantled melody to make room for myth. It echoed in the brooding piano etudes of Chopin, who once said, "After Beethoven, everything is fragments." It pulsed through the democratic fervor of the 1848 revolutions, where students marched through cobblestone streets shouting lines from Schiller's Ode to Joy as if it were a battle cry. Yet even as his music became a monument, something of its raw human core threatened to vanish beneath the marble. Conductors polished his symphonies into gleaming spectacles. Critics dissected his forms like anatomists. Audiences arrived in finery, expecting catharsis on schedule. The man who had bitten a wooden rod to feel his piano's vibration was now entombed in reverence, safe, distant, untouchable. But Beethoven had never been safe. And then, in a quiet corner of Prague in 1889, a young violinist named Marta Voskova played the Grosse Fuge for the first time. She wasn't supposed to. Her teacher had forbidden it. Too chaotic, he'd said. Too broken for a young woman's hands. But Marta had found a copy tucked in the back of a second-hand shop. Its pages yellowed and water-stained, the binding held together by twine. That night, alone in her attic room with only a single candle for light, she played it anyway. The piece didn't sound like anything she knew. It didn't resolve. It didn't comfort. It raged, it whispered. It fractured into shards of dissonance, only to reassemble itself in trembling harmony. Her fingers stumbled. Her bow slipped. At one point she stopped entirely, her chest tight with something between awe and terror, because it wasn't just music. It was a voice that had chosen her, across time, across silence, to say, "You are not alone in your chaos." Marta would go on to become a respected performer, but she never played the Grosse Fuge in public. She kept it for herself, for nights when the world felt too orderly, too polite, too certain. And in doing so, she became part of a hidden lineage, not of virtuosos, but of listeners who heard more than notes. They heard questions, they heard wounds. They heard hope, not as a triumph, but as a choice made again and again in the dark. This lineage would stretch far beyond concert halls. In 1923, in a basement jazz club in Harlem, a pianist named Elijah Reed played a solo that borrowed Beethoven's four-note Fate motif, but bent it through the blues. He didn't call it homage, he called it conversation. "Old Ludwig," he'd say with a grin, knew a thing or two about knocking. The crowd didn't clap. They swayed. They nodded. They understood. In 1945, In a displaced persons camp near Munich, a group of Holocaust survivors gathered around a broken radio. Someone had repaired it with salvaged parts, a coil from a tank, wires from a typewriter. When the Ninth Symphony crackled through the static, no one spoke. They simply stood, arms around one another, as if the music were stitching them back together. A child, no older than 6, asked why the singers sounded like they were crying. Because, her grandmother whispered, they remember what it costs to be human. And in 1969, on a dusty road in Alabama, a civil rights marcher named Clara Johnson hummed the Ode to Joy under her breath as state troopers advanced. She didn't sing it loud. She didn't need to. The melody was armor. It reminded her that joy wasn't the absence of suffering. It was the refusal to let suffering have the final word. Beethoven's music kept finding its way into the cracks of history, not as a relic, but as a companion. And then, in the late 20th century, something new began to happen. Technology, that restless child of the modern age, turned its gaze toward the past, not to preserve it, but to listen to it differently. In a quiet lab at Stanford University in 1998, a team of musicologists and engineers undertook an unusual project. They sought to reconstruct how Beethoven might have heard his own music during the final years of his life. Using medical records, historical accounts of his symptoms, and modern audiology, they created digital simulations of his auditory world. The results were haunting. At first, high frequencies faded, violins became muffled, flutes turned ghostly. Then mid-range tones blurred. By the time he composed the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven likely heard only a narrow band of low frequencies, cellos, basses, timpani, like a world underwater. Yet his scores from this period are filled with delicate high passages, shimmering string tremolos, soaring soprano lines. He wrote them not because he could hear them, but because he knew they belonged. One researcher, a young woman named Dr. Lena Cho, stayed late one night to listen to the simulated ninth. When the chorus entered, tears filled her eyes, not from the beauty, but from the sheer audacity of it. He composed a universe he could no longer perceive. She thought of her grandfather, who had gone deaf in his old age and used to say, "The music doesn't leave you. It just moves inside." Lena began to wonder, what if Beethoven's deafness wasn't a limitation, but a lens? What if losing the noise of the world allowed him to hear something deeper, the architecture of sound itself? She started a new project, not to simulate his hearing, but to translate his process. She fed his sketchbooks into AI models trained on music theory, acoustics, and emotional resonance. The goal wasn't to complete his unfinished works, many had tried and failed, but to trace the path of his thinking. How did he move from a single motif to a full symphony? How did he hold entire orchestras in his mind? The AI, after weeks of analysis, began to generate visual maps, networks of notes, emotions, and structural choices that looked less like scores and more like neural pathways. One map, for the cavatina, glowed with clusters of sorrow, then resolution, then a strange, quiet joy that pulsed like a heartbeat. "This isn't music," Lena told her colleagues. "It's empathy made audible." Meanwhile, across the ocean, in a small village in Japan, a retired physics professor named Hiroshi Tanaka had begun a quiet experiment of his own. Deaf since childhood, Hiroshi had never heard Beethoven, but he had felt him. As a boy, he'd placed his hands on record players, letting vibrations travel up his arms. Later, he built a special chair that translated symphonies into tactile rhythms, low notes in the legs, high notes in the fingertips. When he listened to the ninth, he didn't feel joy. He felt connection. The chorus wasn't singing words. It was creating a field of resonance, a shared frequency that linked everyone in the room. He began teaching workshops for deaf children, using Beethoven's music to show them that sound wasn't just air, it was energy, intention, community. Beethoven, he told his students, wasn't trapped in silence. He was the first to understand that music lives in the body. Back in Vienna, in the very city where Beethoven once paced the streets in frustration and fury, a group of street musicians began playing his works in unexpected places, not in concert halls, but in subway stations, refugee shelters, hospital waiting rooms. They didn't announce themselves. They simply began to play, sometimes the Fifth, sometimes the Moonlight Sonata. Once the entire Ode to Joy played on battered violins and a dented trumpet. People stopped. They wept. They joined in, humming, clapping, swaying. A Syrian refugee who hadn't spoken in weeks began to sing the German words he'd learned in school. A nurse on her break closed her eyes and mouthed, "Alle Menschen werden Brüder." All people become brothers. No one owned the music. No one controlled it. It simply was. Alive, messy, human. And then, in the year 2025, something quietly extraordinary occurred in a digitized archive of Beethoven's conversation books, those notebooks in which friends wrote questions and comments. During his deaf years, a previously overlooked entry was discovered. Tucked between a grocery list and a note about tuning a piano was a single smudged line in Beethoven's own hand, written not in mirror script, but in clear, urgent script. The silence is not empty. It is full of listening. Scholars debated its meaning. Was it a fragment of a letter? A diary note? A line from a poem he never finished? But Lena Cho, now a professor, understood immediately. It wasn't a statement. It was an invitation. She reached out to Hiroshi Tanaka. She contacted Marta Voskova's great-granddaughter, now a sound artist in Berlin. She found Clara Johnson's granddaughter, a community organizer in Montgomery. She even tracked down Elijah Reed's grandson, a hip-hop producer in Brooklyn. Together, they proposed an unprecedented performance, not of Beethoven's music, but with it. On a crisp November evening in 2025, in cities across 6 continents, people gathered. In Vienna, a deaf choir signed the Ode to Joy as an orchestra played. In Tokyo, Hiroshi's tactile chairs pulsed with the Fifth Symphony's rhythm. In Harlem, Elijah's grandson layered Beethoven's motifs over a beatbox and spoken word. In a refugee camp in Jordan, children painted murals inspired by the Pastoral Symphony, while a local ensemble played outdoors. And in Bonn, Beethoven's birthplace, a single piano stood in the town square. No pianist, just the instrument, open to the air. Anyone could sit. Anyone could play. A young girl no older than Beethoven had been when his father dragged him from bed sat down. She knew only one piece, the opening of the Für Elise. Her fingers were small, her timing imperfect. But as she played, others joined. On violins, on flutes, on phones playing recordings. The music swelled, not perfectly, not grandly, but together. At that moment, thousands of miles away, in a lab in California, Lena Cho watched a real-time visualization of the global performance. The data streamed in. Sound waves, heart rates, motion sensors from Hiroshi's chairs, sign language translations. On her screen, it all converged into a single pulsing network of light. She thought of Beethoven in Heiligenstadt, writing his testament in despair. She thought of him turning to face the applause he couldn't hear. She thought of the wooden rod between his teeth, the conversation books, the smudged sketches, the unfinished fugues, and she realized he had never been finished. Because the music wasn't his alone. It never was. It belonged to the girl in Bonn, to the refugee in Jordan, to the deaf child in Tokyo, to the jazz pianist in Harlem, to every person who had ever felt broken and still chose to create. The performance ended. The screens faded to black. But in the silence that followed, something hummed, not a note, not a frequency, but a presence, as if Beethoven, somewhere in the vast quiet he had come to know so well, was still listening. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was smiling. In the weeks after the 2025 global performance, something unexpected happened. The music didn't fade. It multiplied. What began as a coordinated tribute splintered into countless private acts of creation. In Oslo, a teenage coder developed an app that translated Beethoven's late quartets into tactile vibrations for smartwatches, so you could feel the cavatina on your wrist during a bus ride. In Nairobi, a group of street poets wove fragments of the Ode to Joy into Swahili verses about resilience, performing them in markets where radios once played only static. In a quiet suburb of Melbourne, an elderly woman named Elise, who'd never known if the famous piece was really written for her distant ancestor, began hosting Sunday salons where neighbors played Beethoven on everything. Kazoos, kitchen pots, a theremin salvaged from a garage sale. No permission was asked. No institution sanctioned it. The music had slipped its moorings and drifted into the hands of everyday people. And in doing so, it shed its mythic weight and became something far more intimate, a language. Lena Cho watched this unfolding with quiet awe. Her lab at Stanford had become less a research center and more a listening post, collecting not data but stories. A letter arrived from a high school in rural Kentucky. Students had used Beethoven's sketchbooks as inspiration for a mural on the side of their abandoned gym, painting not his face, but his process, arrows, scribbles, repeated attempts at a single phrase. "We used to think genius was about getting it right the first time," one student wrote. "Now we know it's about trying again." Then came the dream. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in March. Lena had fallen asleep at her desk, headphones still on, playing a reconstruction of Beethoven's 10th Symphony, a speculative piece assembled by AI from his fragments. In the dream, she stood in a vast, empty concert hall. The stage was bare except for a single piano, its lid open like a waiting mouth. And seated at it was not Beethoven as history painted him, wild hair, scowling, but a younger man, shoulders hunched, fingers hovering above the keys. He didn't play. He just listened. Lena stepped forward. "What are you waiting for?" she asked. He turned, and his eyes were not angry, but deeply tired. "I'm not waiting," he said. "I'm listening for the next note." "But you're the composer," she said. "You decide the notes," he smiled faintly. "No, the notes decide me." Then the dream shifted. The hall filled with people, not in formal attire, but in work clothes, school uniforms, hospital scrubs. They didn't sit in rows. They circled the piano. Some hummed. Some tapped rhythms on their knees. A child placed a hand on the soundboard. And then, slowly, the piano began to play itself. Not perfectly, not grandly, but with the accumulated weight of all those listening hearts. Lena woke with tears on her cheeks. The next morning, she canceled her lectures and drafted a proposal she'd never dared before. Not to study Beethoven, but to collaborate with him. She called it the Listening Project. The idea was simple and radical. Using the fragments of Beethoven's unfinished works, especially the scattered sketches for his 10th Symphony, Lena would invite musicians, engineers, poets, dancers, and everyday listeners to complete them not as scholars but as co-creators. There would be no single correct version. Instead, the symphony would exist in countless interpretations, each shaped by the life of the person engaging with it. "It's not about finishing what he started," she explained in her pitch. "It's about continuing the conversation he began in silence." To her surprise, institutions that had once guarded Beethoven's legacy like sacred relics agreed. The Beethoven House in Bonn opened its archives. The Vienna Philharmonic offered rehearsal space. Even the European Space Agency, which had beamed the Ode to Joy into deep space decades before, sent a message: "We'll broadcast your first collective performance to the stars." But the real magic happened offline. In a community center in Detroit, a group of formerly incarcerated men met weekly to study Beethoven's Heiligenstadt Testament. They didn't read it as history. They read it as a mirror. One man, Marcus, who'd served 17 years for a crime he didn't commit, began composing a string quartet based on the emotional arc of the letter: shame, rage, despair, then that quiet, stubborn turn toward purpose. "He didn't write to be saved," Marcus said. "He wrote to save himself." That's the difference. Meanwhile, in a remote village in the Andes, a Quechua flutist named Killa heard a recording of the 5th Symphony on a crackling radio. She didn't recognize the orchestra, but she recognized the rhythm, the da-da-da-dam. It echoed the call of the mountain wind, the beat of the earth after rain. She transcribed it into her own notation, then played it on a clay flute passed down through generations. When she sent a recording to Lena's project, the team discovered something astonishing. The intervals, though played on a non-Western scale, aligned almost perfectly with Beethoven's original harmonic tension. As if across continents and centuries, two souls had heard the same truth in different tongues. The project grew like a root system, underground, interconnected, alive. Then came the glitch. Or perhaps it wasn't a glitch at all. While scanning a newly digitized page from Beethoven's sketchbooks, long misfiled as a grocery list, Lena's team noticed something odd. Beneath a faded ink smudge, under ultraviolet light, appeared a series of tiny dots and dashes. At first they assumed it was accidental, ink splatter perhaps. But when mapped, the pattern resembled Morse code. Except Morse code hadn't been invented until decades after Beethoven's death. Intrigued, Lena consulted a historian of cryptography. Together they overlaid the pattern with Beethoven's known handwriting rhythms. The dots aligned with places where his pen had pressed hardest, often where he'd crossed out a note in frustration. The dashes matched elongated strokes like those in his repeated revisions. It wasn't Morse code. It was Beethoven code, a system of emphasis and erasure that, when interpreted, spelled out a single phrase in German: Der Klang ist in der Stille geboren. Sound is born in silence. The discovery sent ripples through the academic world. Skeptics called it pareidolia, the mind seeing patterns in noise. But others felt a strange certainty. After all, hadn't Beethoven written in his conversation books, "The tones are in my head, not in the air"? Hadn't he composed entire movements while pacing in total quiet? Lena didn't argue. She simply added the phrase to the project's guiding principle. And then, the most unexpected collaborator arrived. His name was Amari, and he was 8 years old. Born profoundly deaf, Amari had never heard a single note of music. But he'd grown up feeling it, through floors, through walls, through the chest of his grandfather, who played double bass in a local orchestra. When his teacher told him about Beethoven, Amari's eyes lit up. He was like me, he signed. Through his school, Amari joined the Listening Project. He didn't compose with sounds. He composed with movement. Using a motion capture suit, his dance, a swirl of arms, a stomp, a sudden stillness, was translated into musical phrases by software Lena's team had developed. The result wasn't a symphony in the traditional sense. It was a conversation between body and silence, gesture and resonance, and when they played it for the first time in the Stanford lab, something uncanny happened. The piece began with a low drone, Amari's slow turn. Then came sharp staccato bursts, his foot hitting the ground. In the middle, a long pause, Amari holding his breath, waiting. And then, rising from that pause, a single, pure tone that swelled into harmony. Lena played it back. Then again. On the third listen, she froze, the final chord. It matched a sketch in Beethoven's 10th Symphony notebook, a chord he'd written and crossed out, with the marginal note, zu sanft? Too soft. But Amari hadn't seen the sketch. He'd never been shown it. How? Lena whispered. Amari just smiled and signed. I asked the silence. It answered. Word of Amari's piece spread. Soon, deaf schools around the world began submitting their own silent compositions, not as imitations, but as conversations across time with a man who had once stood alone in the dark and chosen to create anyway. In Vienna, the organizers of the annual Beethoven Festival did something unprecedented. They opened the main concert not with a professional orchestra, but with a global choir of deaf and hearing performers, signing, playing, dancing Amari's piece alongside fragments of the Ninth. Projected above them were real-time visualizations of brain activity from listeners around the world, glowing in synchronized waves. For the first time, the music wasn't just heard. It was felt, seen, lived, and still, the work wasn't finished. Because Beethoven's true genius wasn't in the notes he wrote, but in the space he left between them, the space where we are invited to lean in, to listen, to add our own voice. In Bonn, the piano in the town square remained. People still sat at it. Some played perfectly. Some fumbled. A few just placed their hands on the keys and closed their eyes, remembering. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rhine, an old man sat down. He had no sheet music. He wore work boots and a faded jacket. He played a few hesitant chords, nothing recognizable. Then he stopped. He placed a single sheet of paper on the music stand. It was a copy of the Heiligenstadt Testament. He didn't read it aloud. He just let it sit there, in the open air, as the first stars appeared. A young girl passing by paused. She read the first line, "O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic." She looked at the old man. "Is it true?" she asked. Did he really think no one understood him? The man smiled. He thought that. But he wrote anyway. That's the point. The girl sat beside him on the bench. She placed her small hand over his on the keys. Together they pressed down on a single note, C, deep and resonant. It wasn't a symphony. It wasn't even a melody. But it was a beginning. And somewhere, in the vast quiet that Beethoven knew better than anyone, it was enough. The note C lingered in the Bonn evening air longer than it should have. Not because of acoustics or the quality of the piano. Its strings were worn, its hammers softened by years of touch. but because something had shifted. The old man and the girl didn't move. Neither did the few passers-by who'd paused to listen. Even the river, usually murmuring its endless current toward the North Sea, seemed to hold its breath. Later, no one could say who first began to hum. Perhaps it was the baker from the shop across the square, wiping flour from his hands, or the student with headphones around her neck, drawn by the raw simplicity of that single tone. One by one, voices joined, not in tune, not in harmony, but in presence. A low drone rose from the crowd, then a higher echo, then a child's off-key whistle. It wasn't a performance. It was an instinct. As if the silence Beethoven had once inhabited wasn't empty, but full of waiting voices, and they had finally found permission to speak. News of the gathering spread not through headlines, but through whispers. "Did you hear what happened in Bonn?" People asked. They didn't play a symphony. They played a question, and that question, what does it mean to listen, began to ripple outward. In Reykjavik, a glaciologist named Einar installed hydrophones deep within a melting ice cave. He wasn't studying climate data this time. He was listening for resonance. When he played back the recordings, he heard something astonishing. The ice, as it fractured and shifted, produced low-frequency pulses that aligned almost exactly with the opening rhythm of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Not perfectly. Nature never obeys human notation, but close enough to feel intentional, as if the earth itself were humming along. He sent the audio to Lena Cho's listening project, along with a note. Maybe he wasn't fighting fate. Maybe he was tuning into it. Lena played the ice recording alongside the orchestra version. The dissonance was jarring at first, glacial groans against violins, but then something settled. The two sounds didn't merge. They conversed. The ice spoke of time, of pressure, of slow transformation. The orchestra answered with urgency, with human fire. Together they told a story older than either. Meanwhile, in a neon-lit studio in Seoul, a programmer named Ji-hoon was experimenting with something he called emotional sonification. He'd fed Beethoven's conversation books, those fragile pages filled with pleas, frustrations, and grocery lists, into an algorithm that translated written emotion into musical phrases. Grief became a descending cello line, hope a rising flute, anger sharp brass stabs. When he played the result, it didn't sound like a symphony. It sounded like a mind. But the real breakthrough came when he combined it with Amari's motion-captured dance. The boy's gestures, his pauses, his sudden bursts of energy, became the rhythm. The emotional sonification became the melody. And beneath it all, Einar's glacial pulses provided the bass. The piece was raw, uneven, alive. It had no title. They simply called it listening. When they streamed it online, something unexpected happened. Viewers didn't just listen. They responded. A woman in Lagos recorded herself weeping while the grief motif played, then sang a Yoruba lullaby over it. A teenager in Buenos Aires layered the track with a tango accordion and uploaded it with the caption, "Beethoven danced." 2. In a refugee camp near the Syrian border, a group of children used empty cans and sticks to recreate the rhythm, their laughter ringing through the final bars. The piece was no longer Ji-hoon's. It belonged to everyone who touched it. Back in Vienna, the curators of the Beethoven Museum faced a dilemma. Visitors weren't coming to see glass cases of yellowed manuscripts or replicas of his ear trumpets. They were coming to add to the story. A violinist left a bow hair tied with red thread. A poet slipped a handwritten sonnet into a donation box. A deaf teenager placed a small stone on the exhibit bench, smooth, dark, warm from her pocket, and signed to the guard, "This is my silence." He would understand. At first, the staff quietly removed the offerings, but then Dr. Vogel, the museum's aging director, a man who'd spent 40 years treating Beethoven as a historical artifact, walked through the halls one rainy afternoon and stopped cold. On the floor, beneath a portrait of the scowling composer, someone had drawn in chalk, "You were never alone." Dr. Vogel didn't erase it. He took a photo, and the next day he announced the museum would open a new wing, not for relics, but for responses. A living archive. Visitors could leave anything, a voice memo, a sketch, a pressed flower, a memory. Beethoven didn't write for eternity, Dr. Vogel told the stunned board. He wrote for us, and we owe him our voices in return. The response wing opened on December 16th, the anniversary of Beethoven's baptism. By nightfall, it was overflowing, but the most haunting addition came not from a visitor, but from within. Late one evening, after closing, a night guard named Klaus heard music from the empty gallery. He followed the sound to the response wing. There, on a simple wooden stand, sat a blank sheet of paper, and from it, faint but clear, came the opening notes of the Moonlight Sonata. Klaus checked every room. No instruments, no hidden speakers. The paper remained blank. Yet the music played on, soft, hesitant, as if learning to speak for the first time. He didn't report it. He sat down, and for an hour he listened to it. The next morning, the paper was still there. And on it, in faint pencil, someone had written, "Thank you for hearing me." No one claimed it. No one explained it. But from that day on, the response wing always kept one blank page on display. Across the Atlantic, Amari was invited to the Kennedy Center. Not to perform, but to teach. He stood on stage with a dozen deaf children from across the U.S., each wearing a motion capture suit. Lena Cho stood in the wings, holding her breath. The children didn't know the Fifth Symphony. They didn't need to. Lena had asked them only one question. "What does courage feel like in your body?" They answered with movement. One child crouched low, then sprang upward. Da-da-da-dam! Another spun in a tight circle, arms pulling inward, then flung them wide, like joy breaking chains. A third stood perfectly still for 30 seconds, then took one step forward. That was the most powerful of all. The audience didn't applaud. They rose to their feet and signed "thank you" in unison, a forest of hands blooming in the dark. Afterward, a journalist asked Amari what he hoped people would take away. He thought for a moment, then signed slowly, so the interpreter could keep up. Beethoven didn't lose his music when he went deaf. He just moved it inside. And that means it's still there, in all of us. The quote went viral. But more importantly, it sparked a quiet revolution in music education. Schools began teaching silent composition, using gesture, breath, rhythm of heartbeat. Children learned that music wasn't just sound. It was intention. It was attention. And then, the discovery. In a dusty attic in a village outside Prague, an elderly woman named Clara was clearing out her grandmother's belongings. Among the linens and photographs, she found a small wooden box. Inside was a set of wax cylinders, the kind used in the earliest phonographs, and a letter dated 1901. The letter was from a young technician named Thomas, who'd worked with Thomas Edison's European associates. He wrote that he'd visited an old man, a former servant in Beethoven's household, who claimed to possess something extraordinary, a recording, not of Beethoven playing, but of him speaking. According to the servant, in Beethoven's final months, a visiting inventor had brought an experimental phonograph. Desperate to hear his own voice one last time, Beethoven had spoken into the horn, not words, but sounds, humming, whispering, a fragment of the Ode to Joy melody. The servant, sworn to secrecy, had hidden the cylinders for decades. Clara, trembling, took the cylinders to Prague's National Museum. Experts were skeptical. Beethoven died in 1827. The first practical phonograph wasn't invented until 1877, but the cylinders were real. Early, fragile, likely experimental prototypes brought to Vienna by a curious engineer. After months of delicate restoration, they played the first cylinder. Static. Then a low hum. Then a voice. Not clear, not strong, but unmistakable. Guttural, strained, yet fiercely alive. It wasn't singing. It was listening. The voice would pause, as if waiting for an echo. Then it would try again, adjusting pitch, searching. On the second cylinder, clearer, a single phrase, repeated like a mantra. Hurt. Hurt. Here. Here. And then, so faint it might have been imagination, mich. Me. The room fell silent. Not out of respect. Out of recognition. This wasn't a performance. It was a plea. When Lena heard the recording, she didn't cry. She laughed, a soft, astonished sound. All this time, she whispered, we thought he was composing despite silence. But he was composing for it. He was making music that could be heard even when sound failed. She knew what to do. The listening project announced its next phase. Not a performance, but a broadcast. On the winter solstice, when darkness is longest, they would transmit the restored Beethoven voice fragments into deep space, alongside the global listening composition. not as a message to aliens but as a mirror to ourselves, a reminder that even in the void, we are still calling out. Still listening. As the date approached, people prepared in their own ways. In New Mexico, a group gathered at the Very Large Array radio telescopes, holding hands as the signal beamed upward. In Mumbai, families lit candles and played Beethoven on harmoniums and tablas. In Antarctica, researchers at a remote station stood outside in 40 degrees cold, breath steaming, playing the Fifth Symphony on kazoos, because, one said, even joy can be silly and still be true. And in Bonn, the piano in the square was wrapped in woven blankets, gifts from strangers, to keep it warm through the frost. The night of the solstice, Lena stood alone in her lab. The broadcast was automated. She didn't need to be there, but she wanted to witness the moment the signal left Earth. On her screen, data streams flowed, radio waves piercing the ionosphere, carrying a man's voice that hadn't been heard in nearly 2 centuries. She thought of Beethoven in Heiligenstadt, writing his testament in despair. She thought of Amari's hands on the piano keys. She thought of ice caves and refugee camps and chalk on museum floors. And then, as if on cue, her computer pinged. A new message in the Listening Project inbox. Subject line, from the silence. She opened it. It was a single audio file. No name, no explanation. She pressed play. At first, nothing. Just the soft hiss of empty space. Then faintly a rhythm. Not the 5th, not the 9th. Something new. A pattern of pulses, regular but uneven, like a heartbeat learning to sync with another. Lena held her breath. The pulses grew clearer. They weren't random. They were responding. To the broadcast, to the music, to the plea. Hurt mich. She checked the metadata. The signal wasn't from Earth. It was from deep space. Origin unknown, strength weak but persistent. Impossible, of course. A glitch, cosmic interference. A trick of the mind. But as she listened, tears filled her eyes. Because whether it was real or imagined didn't matter. What mattered was that she heard it. And in that moment, Beethoven's greatest lesson came full circle. We listen not to confirm what is, but to imagine what could be. The signal continued, soft and steady as the solstice turned, and somewhere, in the vast quiet between stars, a conversation began. The signal didn't stop. For 3 days, it pulsed softly through Lena's speakers, steady, rhythmic, just on the edge of pattern. Scientists at SETI dismissed it as solar wind interference. Astronomers chalked it up to a glitch in the deep space array. But Lena didn't delete it. She looped it. Played it while she made tea. Let it hum beneath her thoughts as she walked through campus at dusk. Then, on the 4th night, it changed. A new layer emerged. Not a pulse, but a tone. Low, resonant, achingly familiar. It matched the C from the Bonn piano. The same note the old man and the girl had pressed together weeks before. Coincidence, her rational mind insisted. Yet her body knew better. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath slowed. It was as if the sound weren't coming from the speakers at all, but rising from the floor, from the air, from the quiet space between heartbeats. She recorded it. Sent it to Ji-hoon in Seoul. Within hours, he'd run it through his emotional sonification algorithm. The result wasn't data. It was a feeling, recognition. It's not a message, Ji-hoon messaged back. It's a mirror. Meanwhile, in Bonn, the piano had become a pilgrimage site. People didn't just play it, they left things beside it. A seashell from the Pacific, a dried sunflower from Kansas, a child's drawing of a man with wild hair and a wooden stick in his mouth. One morning, someone placed a vintage ear trumpet on the bench, rusty, dented, impossibly old. No one knew where it came from. But when the noon sun hit it just right, it cast a shadow that looked like a treble clef. Dr. Vogel from the Vienna Museum flew to Bonn to see it. He didn't take notes. He sat on the bench and closed his eyes. He would have hated all this, he murmured to no one. The fuss, the reverence, then he smiled. But he would have loved that they're still listening. Back in Antarctica, the researchers who'd played kazoos on the solstice received an unexpected delivery, a crate of hand-knit ear warmers, each with a tiny musical note embroidered in silver thread. No return address, just a note. For when you listen in the cold, they put them on. And that night, under the aurora, they played again, not Beethoven's music, but their own, a melody made of wind, ice, and home. They recorded it and sent it to Lena. She wove it into the signal. Now. The deep space pulse carried Antarctic wind. Bon piano C, Prague voice fragments, Amari's breath, glacial groans, and children's laughter, all threaded together like a tapestry of human listening. And still, the signal responded, not by mimicking, but by harmonizing. The new tone shifted slightly, finding a perfect fifth above the C, then a third, then a chord, simple, open, full of space. It wasn't complex. It was kind. Lena began to suspect something she couldn't yet name. This wasn't alien intelligence. It was something older, something quieter, not a who, but a how. The universe's own way of resonating with intention. She called it the listening field. Her idea was met with polite skepticism. But one person believed her instantly, Hiroshi Tanaka, the deaf physicist in Tokyo. Of course, he wrote, sound isn't just vibration, it's connection. And connection has a frequency. He proposed an experiment. Using his tactile chairs, he would translate the deep space signal into physical pulses. Then he'd invite deaf participants to feel it, not as data, but as presence. The first session was held in a quiet room overlooking Tokyo Bay. 10 people sat in the chairs, eyes closed. Hiroshi played the signal. At first, nothing. Then, a low thrum in their legs, a gentle ripple in their hands. One woman gasped, "It's holding me," she signed. Another began to cry. "It knows I'm here." Hiroshi recorded their responses, not as scientific results, but as poetry. He sent them to Lena. The silence isn't empty. It's full of hands reaching back. The phrase spread. Graffiti artists painted it on walls in Berlin, Cape Town, and Sao Paulo. A monk in Bhutan stitched it into a prayer flag. In Detroit, Marcus, the formerly incarcerated man who'd written a quartet from the Heiligenstadt Testament, tattooed it on his forearm. And then, Amari had a dream. He told his mother it was simple. He was standing in a forest made of piano strings. They stretched from earth to sky, shimmering with dew. When the wind blew, they didn't make noise. They pulled, like invisible threads connecting everything. In the center stood Beethoven, not old, not scowling, but young. He held no pen, no score, just an open palm. Amari reached out. Their hands didn't touch. But between them a single note bloomed, silent, bright, alive. When Amari woke, he knew what to do. He contacted Lena. "We need to build a forest," he signed. At first she didn't understand. But then he explained, not a real forest. A listening forest. An installation where people could stand among tall, tuned wires, like a harp the size of a city, and feel the wind make music. The wires would be connected to sensors that translated the deep space signal into subtle vibrations. So when the universe spoke, the forest would hum. "It won't be heard," Amari said. "It'll be felt." Like he felt it, Lena's team designed it. Engineers from 6 countries volunteered. The first listening forest was built in a reclaimed quarry outside Bonn, stone walls cradling 120 steel wires, each tuned to a note from Beethoven's late quartets. Solar panels powered the signal receiver. At night, bioluminescent moss glowed at the base of each wire, pulsing softly in time with the cosmic rhythm. On opening day, no speeches were given, no ribbon cut. People simply walked in. A woman who hadn't spoken since her son died in a war placed her palm on a wire. It trembled. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, she whispered, "I hear you." A violinist played nothing, just stood in the center, letting the forest's vibrations move through her body. Afterward, she said, "It's not music. It's home." And Amari? He sat on the ground, back against the central post, eyes closed, smiling. News of the forest spread. Soon others appeared, in the red rocks of Utah, in a bamboo grove in Kyoto, on a hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Each was unique, shaped by its land, its people. But all responded to the same signal. Then came the silence, not the deep space signal, but the world. On a morning in late spring, every listening forest went still. The wires stopped humming. The moss dimmed. The signal, gone. Panic rippled through the network. Had the array failed? Had the source vanished? Lena checked every system. Nothing broken. The deep space antennas still received the carrier wave, empty, quiet, waiting. "It's not broken," Hiroshi wrote. "It's listening." And then from Bonn, a child's voice. "We have to answer." The idea spread like breath. Not with technology, with presence. That night, At every listening forest, people gathered. Not to play, not to record, just to stand together in silence. In Bonn, the old man and the girl returned. They placed their hands on the same wire. In Tokyo, Hiroshi's group sat in a circle, palms touching. In Utah, Navajo elders sang a blessing without words, just breath and intention. And in the Stanford lab, Lena turned off all machines. She sat in the dark and whispered into the void. Thank you for hearing us. For 3 hours, the world held its breath. Then faint at first. Then clear, the signal returned. But it wasn't alone. Interwoven with the cosmic pulse were new tones, human voices. Not recorded, not broadcast, but felt. The hum of the Bonn crowd, the breath of the Tokyo circle, the silent song of the Utah elders. The universe hadn't just echoed them, it had woven them in. It was no longer a conversation between Earth and stars. It was a chorus, and at its heart, unmistakable, was a rhythm older than language. Da-da-da-dam. Not fate knocking, but life answering. In Vienna, Dr. Vogel stood before the blank page in the response wing. He picked up a pencil, not to write, but to draw. A simple sketch. A man at a piano, hands on the keys, eyes closed. Above him, stars shaped like musical notes. He signed his name at the bottom, not as a curator, but as a listener. In Prague, Clara, the woman who'd found the wax cylinders, visited the attic one last time. She placed a new cylinder on the shelf, empty. For the next voice, she whispered. And in a small room in Alabama, Clara Johnson's granddaughter played the Ode to Joy on a harmonica her grandmother had carried through marches and jail cells. She didn't play it perfectly. She played it true. Outside, the wind picked up. It stirred the leaves. It hummed through power lines. It brushed against the wires of the nearest listening forest. And somewhere, in the space between sound and silence, a man who once bit a wooden rod to feel his music smiled. Because the music wasn't his, it never was. It belonged to the girl in Bonn, to the ice in Iceland, to the refugee, child in Jordan, to the deaf boy in California, to the wind, the stars, the waiting earth. And it was still being written. Years passed. The listening forests never stopped humming. New ones appeared in unexpected places. A rooftop in Lagos, a forgotten monastery in the Himalayas, a community garden in Brooklyn, each tuned not just to Beethoven's notes, but to the voices of its people. The deep space signal continued, now a steady companion, not a mystery to solve, but a rhythm to live by. Lena Cho grew older. She stopped calling it research. She called it tending, like tending a fire or a garden. She taught students not to analyze music, but to listen with their whole bodies. The score is just a map, she'd say. The real journey is in the silence between the notes. Amari became a composer, not of symphonies, but of spaces. He designed concert halls where sound traveled through floors and walls, where deaf and hearing audiences experienced music as one body. He never signed his work. He said the silence already knew his name. Hiroshi Tanaka passed away peacefully at 92, his hands resting on a small wooden box filled with soil from every listening forest. His final note, scribbled on a napkin, "We were never alone. We just forgot how to feel the connection." In Bonn, the old piano remained. Rain softened its wood. Snow dusted its keys. Children still sat at it, some to play, some just to be near it. No one ever removed the ear trumpet. It rusted into the bench, becoming part of the instrument itself. Dr. Vogel retired, but visited the response wing every week. On his last visit, he placed a single sheet of paper on the stand. On it, he'd written, "To Ludwig, thank you for teaching us that silence is not the end of music. It's the space where we learn to listen. We hear you, always." He left it there. No one ever took it down. The global listening composition evolved endlessly. No one owned it. No one copyrighted it. It lived in classrooms, in protests, in lullabies. A Syrian lullaby now opened with the fifth's rhythm. A Navajo rain song closed with the Ode to Joy. Music had become what Beethoven always knew it could be. Not a monument, but a bridge. And then, one quiet autumn evening, the deep space signal changed. It didn't fade. It didn't stop. It simply resolved. The cosmic pulse softened into a single sustained chord. The same one Amari had unknowingly recreated years before. The one Beethoven had crossed out and called zu sanft. Too soft. But now it wasn't too soft. It was perfect. Full of warmth, space, and peace. For 3 days it held. On the 4th morning, it was gone, not vanished. Not broken, just complete. Lena knew. She didn't cry. She walked to the Stanford Listening Grove, a small forest of tuned wires her students had built, and sat beneath the central post. She closed her eyes, listened. The wind moved through the wires. Birds called. A student laughed in the distance, and in that ordinary, beautiful silence she heard it, not as sound, but as certainty. The conversation was finished. Not because it ended, but because it had been understood. Across the world, others felt it too. In Tokyo, Hiroshi's successors turned off the signal receiver and simply held hands. In Bonn, the girl, now a woman, played one last note on the old piano. In Antarctica, the researchers packed away their kazoos and stood in the snow, listening to the wind. No announcement was made. No ceremony held. The world didn't stop. But something settled in the air, like dust after rain. Beethoven's music didn't disappear. It became quieter, deeper, woven into daily life like breath. A mother hummed the Moonlight Sonata while rocking her baby. A busker played the 5th on a dented saxophone. A physicist in Chile used the 9th structure to model dark matter. The genius wasn't in the notes, it was in the listening. And so, the story ends, not with a grand finale, but with a single, shared truth. We are all still here, still hurting, still hoping, still listening. And in that listening, in the space between sound and silence, between one heart and another, Beethoven's music lives on, not as history, but as invitation. Come, sit, listen. The piano is open, the forest is humming, the silence is full, and the next note is yours.